What if a country does not have the capital to import petroleum, food, and medicine? What if its natives have to spend the late-night hours without power, just waiting to see their fans working once again? This is what's been happening in Sri Lanka since it went bankrupt. Its Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, said Sri Lanka is bankrupt. He further said in Parliament, "We are now participating in the negotiations as a bankrupt country. Therefore, we have to face a more difficult and complicated situation than previous negotiations." This has inevitably made millions of Sri Lankans survive without proper food and medicine supply. There is a societal upheaval as well that reached heights during the last 2 weeks. The riots and protests showed what has been done to Sri Lanka in the last 3 worst years in terms of poor governance and corruption. Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves went to only $250 million from $7.6 billion in 2019. This shows how badly Sri Lanka's economy has collapsed, pertaining to the unstable situations. That's why today, we will talk about how Sri Lanka collapsed and how bankrupt the Sri Lankans are. How they're spending their lives in such a formidable time needs to be known. But before we continue, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos like this one. Having said that, let's get started. Sri Lanka has been a country where corruption loomed for the past decades. The poor governance, embezzlement, dynastic politics, and millions of its natives going under the poverty line made things even worse. With each passing day, the situation became worse, until the time reached when this country could not pay interest on debts for the first time in its history. The foreign reserves plummeted sharply. The reason is, Sri Lanka was importing more goods than it was exporting. Furthermore, the pandemic exerted unbearable weight on its already surviving economy, and this is when Sri Lanka declared itself bankrupt. Not only did this declaration lower Sri Lanka's credibility and potential growth, but also it brought egregious threats for the natives. But how bankrupt is Sri Lanka? The conditions the international media and the people are witnessing in Sri Lanka tells the whole story. In a single year, the inflation has gone up by 54.6%. While the food prices have alone increased by 80.1%. The middle class and ordinary natives cannot afford to have a proper meal during any time of the day. At night, the power cuts are making life worse. Thousands of families have to spend their nights without sleeping for a single minute. This is not a new plight. Rather, it's been going on for months. The 13-hour daily power cut has become a norm that the citizens have to accept, with no other choice other than to burn the most coveted petrol in generators. Not only has the power cuts deprived its natives of sleep, but also, it's creating devastating conditions in hospitals. Sri Lankans not only long for the luxuries we know, but also for food, medicine, and fuel to pass days of their lives. People, without any other choice, have to pay more than double to buy food, cooking oil, gas, and other necessities. In Sri Lanka, at present, if you have fortunately found the food to have your breakfast, your next battle would be to find transport. Sri Lanka has faced fuel shortages for the last several months, which made it limit petroleum supply to only essential vehicles. The supply of fuel was cut off for weeks as well. It was only offered to the much-needed vehicles to save foreign revenue being spent on importing petroleum. People have to wait in lines for days outside gas stations to get their vehicles filled. This increased fares and left no other option than to use public transport. However, the situation isn't much different there as well. Sri Lankans prefer to travel by train, since it costs less. However, the jam-packed trains on the inside and the footboards on the outside offer just a little relief to money. Those with their own cars have been living in them to get fuel. One of the car drivers said, "I am living in my car for 2 days to buy fuel," and yet, they're buying fuel at a price many times higher than earlier. According to Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, petrol prices increased from 160 Sri Lankan rupee in January 2020 to 550 Sri Lankan rupee at present. Diesel prices went up by 300%, while super diesels by more than 350%. Fuel isn't the only thing. One of the women said, "I cannot afford milk for my babies." Buying enough rice and coconut sambal, the staple foods, have also become a dream for the ordinary people living in these gravest times. Sri Lanka's energy minister, Kanchana Wijesekara, said, "In terms of fuel and food, our country was going to have to face this crisis at some point in time. Fuel was scarce, food prices went up. He also hinted toward the crisis due to Russia-Ukraine ongoing war, and said, "Due to the recent global crises, this situation has become more acute, and we who were in the frying pan fell into the oven." Sri Lankan Prime Minister said earlier that Sri Lanka's debt-laden economy had collapsed, and now it didn't have capital to pay interest on foreign loans. According to BBC, Sri Lanka has a debt worth $51 billion on its shoulders. Given the fact that now only a few $1,000,000 are left in foreign reserves, formidable threats await Sri Lanka in the future. Due to this reason, Sri Lanka has reached several countries for aid and loans. But, as explained earlier, Sri Lanka won't be dealing with other countries as a developing country, but rather as a bankrupt one. This will certainly change the terms of the deal, pushing Sri Lanka to the margins. It inevitably has to accept the terms, whether they're good or bad for the country. The World Bank has offered Sri Lanka a loan of $600 million, while India, on the other hand, has offered $1.9 billion. Furthermore, the International Monetary Fund is thinking about offering a $3 billion loan after taking certain things into consideration. All of these debts would be transferred to Sri Lanka only if there's a hint of stable political conditions ahead. When the country was almost near bankruptcy, millions of Sri Lankans came out of their homes, protesting against the present government. At some places, these protests converted into riots and upheavals as well. This is what happened recently when thousands of Sri Lankans besieged the presidential palace and broke into it. The president had to flee the country when conditions became precarious. The unbearable inflation and shortage of necessities added fuel to the fire, making the country's future obscure. Recently, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister said that the government is thinking of printing more money to pay government officials their salaries. However, if this happens, high inflation would be rampant and fuel prices would increase many times. The Sri Lankan government has also reached Russia and Qatar to get oil at low prices. To lessen the weight, the government is also thinking of privatizing state-owned Sri Lankan airlines. However, all this is going to lessen the tension by only a fraction. Since Sri Lanka depends upon imports to fulfill its basic needs, the situation is not going to change until systematic policies are made and implemented by a government elected by the people of Sri Lanka. Furthermore, the government would have to make Sri Lanka self-sufficient in food, so at least the starving population can be fed. Earlier, since the imports outweighed exports by $3 billion every year, the government imposed a ban on importing fertilizers and chemicals. It proclaimed to use traditional farming that resulted badly in low yield. The irony is, the government then had to import food items. This points towards the feudal policies Sri Lankans have been facing for years that led to such a bankruptcy. In conclusion, the extent to which Sri Lankans are bankrupt can be guesstimated by knowing its citizens are longing for food, medicine, power, fuel, and political and economic stability. Children cry for milk, while the adults have to bear the hunger, besides the unforgiving heat of the year without power. For Sri Lanka today, food, medicine, fuel, and power are the luxuries they need. What do you think? Can Sri Lanka get back on track? Is it possible for a country like Sri Lanka to outpace the bankruptcy and achieve economic stability? Comment your opinion in the comment section right below. Also, if you loved the video, here's the reminder to give it a like. Subscribe to our channel to watch more videos like this one. Until the next video, stay tuned.